prime minister is in between a rock and a hard place, because he has his coalition, a hard right coalition, calling to move forward with Rafah, and that's the only way to achieve their two stated goals of the war, to destroy Hamas. And Israel says there are 4 remaining battalions of Hamas in Rafah, so that's a very important goal for them to go into Rafah and show that they're going to finish up the job, essentially. And to rescue the hostages. And that's another thing that the far right in Israel believe can be done by military might and not by negotiating with Hamas.
Well, first of all, Gabrielle, can you just give me a kind of how we got to where we are? So talk us through what happened last night.
Last night, at some time overnight, Israeli troops on the ground moved in to Eastern Rafah, on the border there, on the Philadelphia corridor, on the border with Egypt, and they took over the crossing, the Rafah crossing. We've heard a lot about the Rafah crossing because that's where a lot of the aid is coming through from Egypt into Gaza, into the Gaza Strip, which has been besieged for 7 months now, 7 months of war. We've seen video footage of Israeli tanks surrounding the crossing, at least 7 tanks, Israeli flags. We've seen drone footage of empty streets. We know this has come after quite a flurry of activity in that region, in Eastern Rafah, because the day before, so on Monday, Israel issued an evacuation order. They made automated voice calls to over 100,000 Palestinians, some of them residents of Rafah, and some of them displaced people who have fled to Rafah during the course of the war to flee the fighting. They issued evacuation orders to move further north, to move to Khan Yunis, which is the city above Rafah, and to move up until Deir Bala, which is in the central North Gaza Strip, ahead of their operations. The army has said this is a limited operation. They're scanning the area. They're fighting Hamas militants, Hamas operatives. They say they've killed 20 Hamas operatives at this time. We also know that today Hamas fired several rounds of mortar fire. Or Hamas haven't actually taken responsibility. So some militants, could have been Palestinian Islamic Jihad or another local militia group, fired into Israeli territory at the Kerem Shalom border crossing. That's another border crossing that has remained shut since Sunday, when Hamas did take responsibility for firing mortar shells at the border crossing, killing 4 Israeli soldiers. So this has been really a lot of activity over the last 3 days, ahead of what is presumed to be could be a wider operation on Rafah. This has been a much touted operation that the international community has warned Israel not to forge ahead with. This is certainly the first sign that this is happening now.
And the timing of this is really interesting, because there was a point in yesterday evening when Palestinians were celebrating because they thought there was going to be a ceasefire because Hamas had agreed to the terms of one. Israel didn't. Why did Israel not agree to those terms? Why was Hamas prepared to accept the terms of the ceasefire, but Israel not?
It's my understanding, and we've spoken to Israeli official sources, government sources, who say that this proposal that Hamas has accepted was not something that was run by Israel. So we do know that Hamas officials were in Cairo over the weekend examining this certain proposal, which turns out to be a kind of compromise proposal that was put forward by the United States and Egypt, who are, of course, brokering those talks alongside Qatar. So Israel initially reacted very strongly. We had anonymous sources coming forward and saying this is an unacceptable deal. We had members of Israel's far-right government, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister, saying this is a Hamas ploy, this is part of their tricks, and to call to occupy all of Rafah and go ahead and conquer Rafah and forge ahead with that operation. There was a slight backtrack around 3 hours later, after the initial announcement that Hamas has accepted the ceasefire proposal, with the Prime Minister's office issuing a statement saying that Israel will be sending a high-profile delegation to Cairo to examine this proposal. So it hasn't been outright rejected. And also, they say they haven't seen this exact proposal. So it's kind of a bit of mixed messages going on. And I think there is still room for maneuver when it comes to this ceasefire. You say it's all about the timing, and this could be a kind of red herring, almost a way for Israel to put pressure on Hamas to accept maybe a deal that's more acceptable to Israel, and meet them in the middle there. So I haven't lost all hope for a ceasefire deal.
How much international pressure do you think
Mm.
Israel can withstand for a ceasefire? If the White House, for example, is pushing Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, how long can Israel resist those calls?
Yeah, it's a good question. The White House has also been quite adamant that Israel not push ahead with a Rafah operation, and yet we've seen 2 nights of very heavy airstrikes in Rafah. We've seen over 100,000 people asked to evacuate. We actually don't know how many of those people have left Rafah at this time, but Israel seems to be on their own timetable. At the same time, they will be in need of Washington's arms deliveries, which have been delayed. There is ways to pressure Israel to accept a deal. The prime minister is in between a rock and a hard place, because he has his coalition, a hard right coalition, calling to move forward with Rafah, and that's the only way to achieve their two stated goals of the war, to destroy Hamas. And Israel says there are 4 remaining battalions of Hamas in Rafah, so that's a very important goal for them to go into Rafah and show that they're going to finish up the job, essentially. And to rescue the hostages. And that's another thing that the far right in Israel believe can be done by military might and not by negotiating with Hamas. And we have to remember that the deal that swapped Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who was held by Hamas in 2011, saw the release of several Palestinian prisoners, very high profile ones at that, including Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind behind the October 7th attacks on Israel that killed 1,200 people. And saw over 200 kidnapped. So there's a lot of pressure for Israel not to go ahead with this deal, not only because of the ceasefire and to be seen to be capitulating to Hamas, but also not to release high-profile prisoners, especially those with Israeli blood on their hands. So Netanyahu has to balance bowing to the international community and to Washington, and his own government. The Israeli public, I think, overwhelmingly support a deal, especially the families of the hostages, who we've seen taken to the streets in spontaneous protests all across Tel Aviv for 7 months now. And those protests have been getting stronger and wider and louder, and even calling on Netanyahu to step down. I think the pressure might also be ramped up because of the closure of those 2 crossings. So Israel taking over Rafah, Israel taking over, and Israel shutting Kerem Shalom. They have told US President Joe Biden that they will open Kerem Shalom, but that hasn't happened yet. So we have 2 key aid passages that have just been blocked off, with a threat of famine looming, especially in the north. But now what's going to happen in the south? It leaves a lot of things wide open, and it's going to be a very busy few days.